Starting off at number 10, we have Eddie Collins, and this is not to get confused with Eddie Collins, the American baseball player. We are talking about a man who's been locked up for the past 43 years. Eddie was serving time for first-degree murder. Throughout his prison stay, he said, and I quote, "It was a sad situation. It was something I regret and still regret." He was 21 years old, living in Arizona at the time he was locked up. He grew up in the bad part of the city where he was buying drugs with his 17-year-old brother. Well, one day when Eddie and his brother was buying drugs, they got into an altercation, and that's when Eddie pulled out a gun, and you guys know what happens next. Bam bam, life in jail. Moving into number 9, we're talking about Otis Johnson, who just served 44 years behind bars. Otis went to prison at the age of 25 years old for attempted murder of a police officer. Otis has been locked away since the 70s, and now he's just entered into the modern society of complex technology. It's gonna be a really tough time for him, but he did commit a horrible crime. Back in 1998 was when he lost touch with his family, so he doesn't know anything about them or where they are. He's just alone in the world. When he was released from prison, they gave him his ID back, and they gave him 40 bucks. Here you go, spending spree. He is for sure gonna have to renew his ID because I mean he's been locked away for a very long time, and $40 won't actually get you that far. And oh yeah, he also got 2 bus tickets. I mean, where the heck is Otis gonna go? He enters the world as a homeless person. He was released at the age of 69 years old. Most of your life is gone. You've like lived it and it was in jail. You can no longer work, so I'm not sure how he's gonna make a living. Well, I guess that was a decision he should have decided 44 years ago. Number 8, we have John Franzese, who is a 100-year-old mobster who was just released from prison after serving 50 years behind bars. John was released on the 23rd of June of this year, so that was just like weeks ago. He was released from the Federal Medical Center. John was an underboss of the crime organization. John has boasted about killing at least 60 people in his lifetime of crime. It's actually so crazy to me that this guy was allowed to be released into the public. I know he's probably now a very, very harmless old man who can't really do anything, but he didn't give those 60 people a chance at life. I don't know, I'm just saying. Serving 60 years at number 7, we have Harvey Stewart. Harvey was released back in 2011 at the age of 83 years old. Harvey Stewart has a really long rap sheet, from a junkyard heist in Houston to murdering someone. During most of his prison stay, not many people visited him, and Stewart can't recall one person who visited him in the past decade or 2. He has been isolated from the world and doesn't know what's been going on. He doesn't know the Paul brothers are taking over YouTube. So coming out after 60 years must be a huge shock to him, especially this. Like, what is that? How do you explain that that was the most popular thing this year? When he was sentenced to prison, a Volkswagen Beetle cost just $1,700. Shoes were 10 bucks. John F. Kennedy was president. People went to space for the first time. The Beatles just released their first single in the UK. So much has changed over time. Number 6, we have a man who served 62 years behind bars. We're talking about Hugh Elderman. He was a bank robber who was obviously caught. His jail sentence started when he was 23 years old back in 1917. Hugh was the sole survivor of a 4-man gang. Just a few years after being sent to prison, he was able to escape, and he escaped again in 1924. In 1927, he was released to a mental hospital where he passed away at the age of 86 years old. Hugh lost his whole life just because he wanted some money. He didn't want to work for it. He was able to steal $6,000, which is like, what the heck? But back then, that's $6,000 back then. With inflation, the money now would be worth around $124,000. That's still not enough money to just lose your whole life, like to take chance of that. I don't know. Now, this person has lived a really sad story, and this person comes in at number 5. And I'm talking about Charles Edward Ford, who outlived a 64-year-long prison sentence. The sad part is, Charles was innocent. He has served one of the longest sentences as an innocent person. He was actually released from prison just last year. Charles was convicted of murder. Well, here's a little backstory. This took place in the early 50s, and Charles is a black man who appeared in front of an all-white juror in a time where black people didn't have any rights. Charles was just 20 years old at the time, and his life just flashed before him. After 64 years, he was finally released in a nursing center where he's now 86 years old. I mean, this is a really sad situation. There's no way to give him his life back. Howard Christensen is next up on this list at number 4. Howard was sentenced to life without parole for the murder of a teacher in 1937. He was 16 years old at the time when he murdered a teacher. He committed this crime alongside a 17-year-old who was also caught for the crime. That person was also sentenced to life in prison, but they hung themselves back in 1943, just 6 years after being sentenced. About 30 years into the prison sentence, the sentence was changed from life without parole to 200 years in prison. But in 2001, 2001, after serving 64 years, he was released from prison, but just 2 years after that, he passed away. Number 3. Richard Honeck. At the age of 22 years old, Richard was sentenced to life in prison for murder of a former school friend. Life in prison sentence usually varies depending on where you live in the world. It can depend on what state you live in or what city you live in. I know this state has very different laws. Some places they even have a 3-strike law, meaning no matter what crime you commit, if it's 3 crimes, you're sentenced to life. So for Richard, he was paroled after serving 63 years and 1 month in jail. He was released at the age of 85 years old. He lived out another 12 years until he passed away at the age of 97 years old, and that was back in 1976. Now at number 2, we have Johnson Van Dyke Grigsby. Johnson was sentenced to prison back in 1908 for murder. Over the years, he was denied parole 33 times before he was finally released at the age of 89 years old because he was deemed not a threat to anyone anymore. He wasn't a threat to society, so let's just release him. He was released in 1974 after serving 66 years, but he actually quickly returned back to prison voluntarily after finding it too difficult to find a job. So he checked himself back into prison for 2 more years. So now at the age of 91 years old, he's finally out of prison for good. And then 10 years after that, at the age of 101 years old, he passed away. I mean, that's a really sad situation when you check yourself back into prison because you don't know any other life. Finally, at number 1, we have Paul Goodell Jr., who is known to have served the longest prison sentence in the United States, possibly the world. He was sentenced to 68 years in a variety of different New York State prisons, and he actually lived to see the day when he was released from prison. That is actually a very rare thing. At the end of his lengthy sentence, he was paroled at the age of 86 years old. Back in 1911, Paul was convicted of second-degree murder at the age of 17 years old. When Paul was paroled, he actually didn't want to leave prison because that was the only life that he knew. But at the end, he decided to leave. So when he left, there was a lot of reporters there, but he said he doesn't want any publicity. He doesn't want to be on the news. He doesn't even care if people know who he is. Paul went on to live in a nursing home before dying at the age of 93 years old, which is about 7 years after being released from prison. This guy only spent about 24 years of his entire life as a free man. Let's use a get out of jail card at number 10. We're starting off with a wild story about Renee Lima Marin, who was sentenced to 98 years in prison back in 1998 for a robbery while using a gun. The gun was actually not loaded and no one was hurt, but for some reason he was sentenced harshly to 98 years in prison. Lima was 19 years old at the time. Well, it was a shock when after just 10 years in 2008, Lima was released from prison. 6 years after being released, a former prosecutor realized that Lima was released from prison by mistake. So he was sent back where he was sentenced, he was resentenced. During the time he was out of jail, Lima was able to turn his life around. He got a job, he even got married. Lima has been in prison ever since that incident, and this has become a really high profile case, and it leaves us with a lot of questions. Well, this guy has now served a total of 19 years. He served his time. He didn't hurt anyone. He didn't even have bullets in his gun. There was no intent there. And when he was released, he showed that he has changed his life around, so why keep him in prison? What do you guys think about this whole thing? The public is now behind this man, so he's probably going to be released very, very soon. Number 9, we have Eddie Bolden, and he's from Chicago. He's served 22 years behind bars for a double murder charge. Back in 1994, Eddie was convicted based on the testimony of a single eyewitness. Something doesn't seem right there. There were 3 other people who actually placed him at a different location at the time of the murders, but those witnesses never testified. Eddie spent the next few decades in the prison's law library studying his case because he knows he is innocent. His family believed his innocence as well. When Eddie went to prison, he left behind a family and his 1-year-old son. It took 22 years in prison for him to finally be innocent of the crime he was wrongfully convicted of. Eddie's life was just stripped. Eddie kept fighting hard, and he was able to outlive his sentence and prove his innocence. The police should now be worried about a murderer who's been on the loose for the past 22 years. Coming out of prison at number 8, we have Kevin Charles Siegel, who served 25 years behind bars. Kevin was convicted of killing his wife back in 1991. She was found stabbed to death in her apartment. She was stabbed more than 20 times and was left in a bathtub with the water running in an effort to wash away the evidence. Kevin was the prime suspect and he was arrested and he was charged, but he has always maintained his innocence and gone as far as to file numerous appeals since his convictions. Kevin was convicted based off of blood that was found on his personal items in the bathroom, and even on his right shoe there was blood found as well. Well, his right right shoe was finally tested, and it appeared the blood on the shoe was actually his own. Kevin is now in his 60s, and he was granted a motion from the state attorney general's office to reopen the case, and the case was quickly overturned. The general's office chosen to abandon the case and ordered his release. He now has the opportunity to live out the rest of his life as normal as he can in society. Two of Kevin's brothers were in the courtroom when he was released. They were brought to tears. It wasn't proven that Kevin was the killer, but this case just seemed to be dropped. Maybe there was too much legal fees, or maybe there was too much embarrassment for the lack of investigation into this case. Moving into number 7, we have Clarence Moses, who was a Colorado man who was convicted of rape back in 1987. He was convicted of raping his neighbor. Clarence was sentenced to 48 years behind bars, but he only served 28 years. Now this is where the story gets really crazy. Back during the trial, the victim told the police that she has been drinking with neighbors before she returned home, and that was the moment where she was brutally raped twice. When police initially asked her who the attacker was, she actually named 3 different men on who it could be. It could be A, B, or C. The next day, she claimed to have a dream of who the victim was. She went to the police. She says it was this guy, Clarence Moses. He was the attacker. And that was the day Clarence's life changed forever. Over the next years, he maintained his innocence, and Clarence tried to appeal his conviction, but it was unsuccessful. However, in the 90s, he won a legal bid for a DNA testing on the evidence to clear his name, but police actually mistakenly destroyed the evidence. I mean, is this real life right now? How do you accidentally destroy evidence? Because of the lost evidence, he wasn't released yet. Clarence's big break was actually years later, 2012, 28 years after he was sentenced. The actual victim wrote him a letter admitting he was actually the one who had sex with her that night. I mean, what a sick story. Why let a guy serve 28 years for your wrongdoing and then you write him a letter in prison much later? Now at number 6, we have Glenn, who was wrongfully convicted for murder, and he served 30 years because of it. So Glenn was released, and to say, sorry for the mistake, he was given a $30 gift card. I mean, is this real life right now? This is just so disrespectful. $30? Well, luckily under the Louisiana law, where he was in prison, he's actually entitled to a lot more. Well, $400,000 worth in compensation for the time he spent in solitary confinement at a notorious maximum security facility. This is still not enough money in my opinion. You should be entitled to millions of dollars, because for the past 30 years, this man was on death row with very limited privileges in prison. This story made big headline news, and Glenn was interviewed on 60 Minutes. Moving into number 5, we have Lawrence McKinney, who is from Tennessee. He was released from prison back in 2009 after DNA evidence ruled him out as a suspect. It's just too bad that they couldn't rule this out, 31 years ago when he was sentenced. This is absolutely insane. It took investigators, police officers, judges, jury members 31 years to figure out that Lawrence is an innocent man. Right now, Lawrence is fighting for an exoneration case that could grant him $1 million in compensation. So far, he's been denied twice. Lawrence was convicted of rape and burglary back in 1978, and he was sentenced to prison for 115 years. Just imagine that day when he was sentenced. I mean, an innocent person, and you just found out, you just been sentenced for 115 years. When Lawrence was finally released from jail, he was issued $75. I mean, what the heck is he gonna do with that? Hopefully he uses that money to make a ton of phone calls to the right people. A man who served 35 years in prison without a trial strangely comes into this list at number 4. It just doesn't make sense. We're talking about Jerry Hartfield, whose case was very extraordinary. When Jerry was released from prison, he was one of the most unlikely prisoners ever to be freed in Texas. Jerry wasn't exonerated, he wasn't even released on parole, he didn't even finish up his sentence because there really wasn't a sentence for this man. Let me explain. Texas actually just gave up on this case and allowed Jerry to be a free man, which makes absolutely no sense to me. When I was researching this, I took a deep dive onto this one. Jerry was waiting 35 years between trials without a conviction. He was simply just forgotten about in the system. This does happen, and I'm thinking I might make a top 10 video of top 10 prisoners who were just forgotten about in prison for decades. Let me know if that's a good idea. Well, Jerry was put into prison because of a murder, but there was no evidence that this was the guy. He was just sentenced to prison. He could have been the guy. The length of the prison stay wasn't announced. In fact, he was supposed to get a new trial in 1980 after an appeals court reversed his conviction and death sentence because of a flaw fraud during the jury selection. But now he's out due to a fellow prisoner and a public defender who discovered a huge mistake 35 years later. Alright, just like that, number 3, we have a man who's been in prison for 41 years, and he becomes the first Detroit juvenile lifer to get a second life. This right here is William Washington, and back in 1975, when he was just 17 years old, he decided to rob a record store along with 26-year-old Kenneth Rooker. There was a scuffle with the store owner, and this resulted in the store owner being shot to death. Because of this, William received a life without parole sentence for first-degree murder, as well as a second life sentence for armed robbery. Well, 41 years later, he was given a second chance at life. Okay, I want to turn this question to you guys. Let me ask you, what do you guys think about juveniles who commit horrible crime? Should they have a second chance at life? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Number 2, just like number 3, we have another teen killer who has been released. This person was released in Spring Garden Township, which is located in Pennsylvania. We're talking about Scott Griffin, who was found guilty of first-degree murder for fatally shooting his ex-girlfriend, 17-year-old Linda Hagen. And this was back in 1974. Scott was only 16 years old at the time. Scott was serving a mandatory life sentence for the murder, but now he has been paroled. This actually makes him the first juvenile lifer from York County to be released from prison since a significant ruling from the US Supreme Court. Back in 2012, the US Supreme Court ruled that it is unconstitutional to impose automatic life sentences for those who commit crimes before turning 18 years old. So this is when Scott was released after 43 years behind bars. He was able to outlive his insane life sentence. Now he's in his 70s and there isn't much to life that he's able to do. And finally, at number 1, we have Joseph Liggett. Joseph has been behind bars since he was 16 years old back in the 60s. That's about 11 presidents ago. The first person has been to space. Joseph is 79 years old, which makes him the oldest living juvenile offender, and also he has served the longest sentence of any other juvenile offender. That's for sure a record that you don't want to beat. At 16 years old, Joseph took part in a murder of 2 men in Philadelphia. He was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Well, because the recent US Supreme Court decision that deemed a mandatory life sentence for juvenile offenders unconstitutional, this means Joseph now has a chance to be released from prison anytime now. Well, actually, he was already given the chance to be placed on parole immediately, but he declined. The reason why is because he doesn't want to be paroled and just be placed on probation. He wants to serve out his time and just be released as a free man. Okay, so starting us off, number 10, we have Desmond Ricks, who has just spent 25 years behind bars. US prosecutors just dropped all the charges for Desmond because after this case was looked into again recently, investigators found out that the police falsified evidence. Desmond was convicted of gunning down a friend outside a restaurant in Detroit, Michigan back in 1992, and he was sentenced to 32 years in prison. Is this real life right now? So Desmond went to jail because people thought he killed his friend, so for 25 years everyone probably believed that he did it. So for that long, this guy just sat in a jail cell thinking about why he's even there. Desmond was released at the age of 51 years old, and it's gonna be hard for him to go back into society, but you know what, he does have a little bit of help. In a new Michigan law, it awards wrongly convicted prisoners $50,000 each year spent in prison, which means he would be eligible for $1.25 million. We have another innocent man at number 9, Keith Allen Harward. He was just released from prison after serving 33 years behind bars for a crime that he did not commit. He was wrongly convicted in 1982. Keith was convicted of murdering Jesse Perron and raping his wife in Virginia. Keith was released when he was 60 years old. The Innocence Project tweeted this out when he was released. After 33 years of wrongful conviction, hashtag Keith Howard is finally free. So this is a really sad part about this. Keith was able to outlive his prison sentence, but his parents were not able to, which means his parents passed away thinking that their son was a murderer, but he's innocent. Also, Keith was denied going to his parents' funeral, so now he wants someone to pay for this. What a sad, sad situation. Moving into number 8, we have Albert Woodfox, who served 43 years behind bars. Well, actually, Albert was America's longest standing solitary confinement prisoner. Albert had no view of the sky from his 6-foot by 9-foot concrete box, which is like way smaller than my bed, I think. And over that time, he has had no human contact. Anyone in this situation would go crazy. I would go crazy after just 1 hour. There are scientific studies that have shown that you can actually inflict severe psychological damage on an individual by putting them in solitary confinement for just a week. Albert's lawyer has been fighting this for decades. They have been saying that this is an extreme and cruel punishment. What do you guys think? If you murder someone, do you deserve to be in like a small cell for like 40 years, 50 years? Let me know your guys' thoughts in the comment section below. At number 7, we have Ricky Ricky Jackson, who served 40 years in prison. Ricky was convicted at the age of 18 years old for murder he did not commit. I mean, what is going on with this trend here? Why are all these people being sent to jail for a crime that they did not commit? Ricky was 58 years old when he was released, and that was just in 2015, so a couple years ago. There was a federal lawsuit against the city of Cleveland and the police officers who Ricky says helped frame him back in 1975. This wouldn't be the first case where police interfered with an investigation. We all know the Brendan Dassey case, you know, the kid from the Netflix original Making a Murderer. If you haven't watched that show, I honestly highly recommend it. It's really good. Ricky, when he was sentenced, he was actually given the death sentence, but later it was commuted to life in prison. This just makes you think on like how many innocent people there are out there who's been in prison for last like decades. And nowadays we have all these technologies that can avoid the mix-up, but there must be still thousands of people, innocent people, locked away due to the lack of technology back in the day. Number 6, we have a Guinness World Record holder, and we're talking about Aiwa Hakamada, who is a Japanese former professional boxer who was sentenced to death in 1968 for a mass murder that became known as the Hakamada incident. In 2011, he was awarded the Guinness World Record for the world's longest held death row inmate. Definitely a record you don't want to try to go for. In 2014, after being on death row for 46 years, he was released. The trial came to a huge shock to the Japanese public, so apparently after 46 years, a district court found there was reason to believe evidence against him had been falsified. Is this real life right now? Do we have another innocent guy who was on death row serving almost 50 years for something that he didn't do? Alright, number 5, we have Betty Smithy, who served 49 years in prison. Betty walked into prison with a life sentence for murder, and at the age of around 70 years old, she was walking out with a cane. Betty is America's longest serving female inmate. She was behind bars for the murder of a 15-month-old child by strangling the baby while she was babysitting. The court sentenced her to life without parole. After years went by, her sentence was lowered to just 48 years to life. Moving into number 4, we have Patrick Maloney, who just walked out of an Arizona prison after spending nearly 50 years in prison, and this is for killing his mother and his stepfather, and this is back in 1964. Patrick was released at the age of 65 years old, which means, if my calculations are right, he was 15 years old when he committed those horrible crimes. That is just something that doesn't sit well in my stomach. This is a teenager. For almost 50 years, Patrick has been fighting to be released from jail. He was first sentenced to life in prison, and then he had the death sentence, but then it was turned back again into a life sentence. Patrick started working with the attorney from Justice Project, and that was when he was granted hearings in a superior court. The US Supreme Court decided that having a life sentence without the possibility of parole for a juvenile murderer is just too cruel, and actually it's an unusual punishment under the 8th Amendment of the Constitution. I think if you murdered someone, no matter what age you are, I think you should just be sentenced away and forgotten about. But maybe I'm just too harsh. Number 3, we have John Hall, who is actually still in prison, but there is a law that is out now that outlawed an old law that might make him released. Well, let me explain. John has a great chance of getting out of jail very soon. John has been fighting for his life since he was 17 years old after he received a life sentence for his role in a back alley killing in Detroit that claimed the life of a 63-year-old man. The US Supreme Court outlawed mandatory life sentences for juveniles. A judge gave John a potential second chance at life by resentencing him to 40 to 60 years in prison. After having already served 50 years, he's only got like 10 more years to serve, so John Hall, he should be released pretty soon. So this guy totally outlived like a 50 to 60 year life sentence. Number 2, we have Earl Reinhardt, who is now set free after being in prison for 50 years. Earl was released when he was 75 years old. When he was released, he became homeless instantly because he has no money, he has no family members to help him out. Earl has been trying to keep warm in libraries, he's been seen eating in soup kitchens. Earl actually ended up in a nursing home because he couldn't take care of himself. He just got too old. There was not a lot of information on this guy because it just seems like society has just forgotten about him. And this seems to be a common trend for this next one. Finally, number 1, we have McCall Lelung from India, who served 54 years in an Indian jail. McCall was arrested at the age of 23 years old back in 1951 in his home village. McCall was booked under section 326 of the Indian Penal Code for causing grievous harm, which means he inflicted harm on someone, maybe like a stab wound or something. The charge normally results in a sentence of no more than 10 years imprisonment. Well, here's where this story gets crazy. The civil rights organization who investigated the case later found no substantial evidence to support the charge. Less than a year after his arrest, he was transferred to a psychiatric institute in Tezpur, India. Doctors there certified McCall as fully fit, but instead of being released, he was for some reason transferred to a jail where he was just forgotten about. So McCall was forgotten about for 54 years. So for 54 years, for no reason at all, he was just sentenced away. He just had, like, I don't really understand this one. It's really sad if you ask me. I don't get how something like this goes on for over 50 years.